I actually saw Derrida once
Wow. Hello everybody, welcome back to Thoughts. We are doing part 2 of our discussion on postmodernism and Derrida. I'm Hamish, Stewart.
I'm Max Forster.
And we are with Dr. David Baker. Hello, David.
Hello, good to be here again. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. And without further ado, Max, would you like to recap part 1?
So last episode was on postmodernism, and we talked about different definitions of postmodernism. We talked a little bit about Lyotard, we talked about Kwame Appiah, and we focused on the relation between postmodernism and modernism. And if you haven't listened to it, feel free to do so. If you have, you know that the question came up what the intellectual profile of postmodernism was. And we kind of dodged that question a little bit because, as we heard, it's not much of a movement, but much rather a condition of sort. So we promised a better answer to that question. And today we're going to deliver. We are going to talk about post-structuralism, the contemporaneous movement of postmodernism, which is different from postmodernism in that it has its own more worked out intellectual profile. To get right into it, I think, David, we couldn't talk about post-structuralism without talking about Derrida and talking about his appearance at the Baltimore Conference, which was sort of the founding event or the inaugural event for post-structuralism. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And you're talking about the conference that took place in the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University
Right.
on October 18 through 21, 1966. It really was sometimes these things are gradual and sometimes they're explosive. Yeah, in that case, things had just radically changed. The person who changed it was really Jacques Derrida, who was the last speaker. And after he left, a French critic who'd been there named Georges Poulet was walking around the campus and talked to one of the faculty at Hopkins. And Poulet said, we just heard a paper that destroys everything I stand for, but it was a very important paper. So people at the time knew that something big had happened. And that's typically thought of as the sort of inaugurating event in the arrival of post-structuralism generally, Derrida, and deconstruction to the United States.
So what was so radical about what Derrida said in that talk at that conference?
Well, let me preface this by saying, because you've encouraged me to say this, that I actually saw Derrida once at Johns Hopkins. This was quite a few years after 1966. But Derrida used to make annual visits to the Humanities Center. So in other words, that conference established an ongoing relationship between Derrida, the American critical scene, and particularly Johns Hopkins. I went there. I went to a large auditorium. Derrida came on. He looked distinguished with his white hair swept back. I remember he thanked all those who honored him with their presence. And then he talked, as he said he would, for a long time. I think an hour and a half, maybe 2. And I don't remember what he said.
Yeah, to be expected.
Yeah.
I listened to another podcast which said that he was one of the last philosophers that was part of a generation of philosophers that were kind of famous Playboy badasses. Did that persona come off?
No, not when he was standing on the podium, though. I guess you'd have to say that if you wanted to extrapolate from the kind of charisma that he had, it wouldn't surprise you to know that he was actually, as you put it, something of a playboy. Without getting into specifics, that was very much a part of his persona and of
the specifics life. Will be part 3.
Yeah.
I'm joking. Okay, no, that's very interesting. Okay, yeah. So Max, you were wanting to know what was so radical about what Derrida actually said in that original conference.
Right, yeah.
Well, the conference itself was a sort of a chaotic affair. Interestingly, Michel Foucault was invited and didn't come. Others claim it was Levi-Strauss who was invited and didn't come. But in any case, there was a hole in the schedule, and Derrida was invited. He was 36 years old at the time. He was invited at the last minute to fill in the hole and given the last talk. So it was so radical. If you look at the talk that he gave, Structure, Sign, and Play, a lot of it's given over to a very sort of a close reading critique of Levi-Strauss. So the parts that people tend to remember are in the first pages or two, and they establish some of the sort of basic notions of what was to become deconstruction. But Derrida had the task, really, of taking on, one of the giants of structuralism and showing that his own critique of structuralism could be launched within the field of Levi-Strauss's thought. And he did that at some considerable length. So what people understood, including Georges Poulet, was that, well, I guess they understood two things. One, they understood that structuralism would no longer be as dominant a discourse as it had been, like, in a straightforward way, and said it would be the sort of operations within structuralism that would be prominent. And what's also noticeable, if you go back and look at the sort of transcript, what we have of it at that meeting, is that it's hard to put your finger on this, but it's a matter of intellectual style and temperament. And there were several fairly traditional scholars at the Baltimore conference, and they just went off on Derrida. And in the process, articulated what we still today recognize as some of the standard assumptions of humanist scholarship, text, poetry, literature, and so on. They got that this whole sort of traditionalist scholarly ethos had just been punctured. It was an event where people like Georges Poulet suddenly grasped that their futures were going to be very different than the ones they had planned for themselves.
So what was structuralism for Derrida?
Yeah, so for Derrida, of course, he was thinking primarily of the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, whom we mentioned last time. But for Derrida, structure was writ on several levels. He took the linguistic model of Saussure, and then as others had, he extrapolated it to fairly large scale structures of meaning. That's why Levi-Strauss is at the center of his critique, because Levi-Strauss did that in anthropology more convincingly than anyone else. But what Derrida said was that within these structures, whether they be linguistic structures or larger structures, we can always locate a certain play. Here was the sort of germ of the notion of différance. If you think in terms of structure, said Saussure, and then Derrida agreed. What differentiates the elements in any system is simply that they are different. And so Saussure talked about the phoneme, the sound that we use in order to form larger groups of sounds. But there's nothing. If I take for instance the P sound, there's nothing intrinsic. There's no intrinsic P-ness to it. What it is, it's not a T sound, or it's not an R sound, or it's not an S sound. There's a difference between these different phonemes. And so what Derrida said was that difference destabilizes and defines the structure always.
In this inaugural speech, Structure, Sign, and Play, Derrida talks about structure. It's a criticism of structuralism, after all. So he defines structure as a system that is organized around a center.
He said if the structure is, thinking it in very large terms, the structure is simply the totality of what can be thought in any given era, there's always something, he said Derrida, which is implied by the structure, but is not included in the structure, and that is the center, the thing that underwrites everything else, but that is not reducible to everything else.
I'm looking at the list right now here. He has God, man, and essence, and existence, and substance, and transcendentality, consciousness, and so on.
And so on. So it's important to stress, this is what he called the history of the metaphysics of the West. It's really important to stress that Derrida was much more interested in initiating, or at least observing, the play of elements within structure, then he was in the notion that it could be escaped. In fact, he fundamentally did not believe that that structures could be escaped. They were always encompassing. The most that could be done was to operate within them and to some extent against them.
That's maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, about how meaning is produced by structure, how about the productive force of structure, right? Because I feel like there are two sort of two ways to understand that. There's a sort of post-structuralist way of understanding how meaning is produced, and then there's a post-structuralist way how meaning is produced. Before Derrida, the center was thought as something that is constitutive and productive of meaning, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's God, or it's existence and existentialism. It's essence before existentialism. It's man in the Enlightenment, and so on and so on. But then Derrida refutes this idea that a center self-sufficiently can provide meaning. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. If the center is going to be that which authorizes all the rest of it, in most traditional modes of thought, the center itself has to be that which cannot be questioned, that which underwrites everything. By putting out that it's the structure that produces the center, and then vice versa. Derrida showed that centers are not oppositional to or outside or transcendent of structures, but they're kind of an effect of structure.
So I feel like there are two modes of analysis of those, I mean, of structure and center and so on. Perhaps sort of metaphysical analysis, where you have the center as God, or those historical centers, and there's a semiotic way to look at all these words, right, where the center is the transcendental signified, that is purportedly provides meaning, but doesn't actually provide meaning. Meaning is produced intralinguistically in an intralinguistic play.
I should probably say here actually that, or explain what the signifier and the signified is. Just very briefly, the signifier is the word or the picture, and the signified is the idea or the emotion or the object that the expression is associated with. So, for example, take a tree. The word tree, the way you express the word tree, is the signifier, and the actual tree itself, the actual object of the tree, is the signified. So when Max talks about the transcendental signified, he's talking about the center point which fixes everything else.
What really helped me understand the sort of preceding semiotic theory, according to which, you know, there is something pre-linguistic, there are certain objects or things that we signify with words. So and then those objects we take and they provide words and language and so on with meaning. And that's something that Saussure and Derrida, of course, oppose, right? I was looking in the, I think, the epilogue of grammatology, where Derrida talks about signified and signifier. And as you said, David, he doesn't deny or refute the existence of something such as the signified. I mean, he refutes the existence of something such as the pre-linguistic signified, but he does admit that there are signified and signifier, only that both of these things, whatever they are, they work inside language. So language is a circle of sort of a system, a dynamic play that's of signified and signifier that are self-referential, sort of, or
Yes, I think that's entirely right. I guess both what Derrida and structuralists before him are reacting against is a deeper, almost theological sense that words and things attach somehow to one another. That he holds not to be true at all. It's language rather that defines things, which allows us to think of them as distinct things. But you're right. It's not a form of idealism. It's a kind of a quasi-theological investigation of Western metaphysics through the structuralist thinking of Ferdinand de Saussure and others.
So we've talked quite a bit about how sort of the center and identity and meaning is produced by differences and play and intralinguistic dynamics, sort of, rather than by a transcendental signified. But we haven't really talked about another consequence of this play, which is difference as a productive force. That is a politically explosive thing, right? Any sort of identity, any sort of representation, any sort of identity politics, whenever you formulate a political entity, there will always be something on the outside that provides the identity of such. So that's where I think Derrida's fascination with marginality, with periphery, with difference also has a political dimension.
Yeah, that's right, Max. I mean, I think Derrida really was consistently interested in the marginal, the oppressed, the ways in which a system could function to put very real human beings at a disadvantage to others. At the same time, it's consistent with what I was saying earlier, is that Derrida did not think that all exclusions and all hierarchies whatsoever were, on the one hand, escapable, and on the other hand, noxious in and of themselves. So, famously he says, wonderfully pithy little, claim, a red light is not repressive. In the same paragraph, he says, the law, the tribunal, or the police as political powers are not primarily repressive in themselves. Every police is not repressive. So he seemed to, he acknowledged the role of structuring agencies in human affairs. And he also knew that those structuring agencies could dispossess and humiliate and harm people, but he did not imagine that those kinds of structuring agencies could be rejected just because they exerted some kind of repression. A red light tells you to stop the car. It's not repressing you when it does that.
I mean, structure is a necessary condition for intelligibility. I mean,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Intelligibility depends on structure, and without it, I mean, if you remove, the literal sign, the red light, then cars are proceeding in a completely unstructured way. Intelligibility, just in and of itself, makes distinctions, establishes hierarchies, and from all that can be extrapolated, the police, as he calls it, using the term in a kind of larger French sense, I think. What deconstruction in Derrida's hands implies is that you cannot escape from Western metaphysics, that it is always the larger project within you must operate.
Presumably there were some people that were saying you could escape from structuralism.
Yeah, so ever since I guess the advent of postmodernist and post-structuralist cultural movements, there have been those who, in a more sort of romantic vein, have wanted to claim that we can transcend or escape or evade or overthrow structures, which they sometimes think of as structures of power, and societal structures and so on. Derrida had in his thought a really sort of a rigorous anti-romantic line that pointed to the impossibility of finally doing that. He said that, it's the structure is the ground on which, meaning emerges, and you cannot get yourself off that ground. Play will happen, oppositions can be framed, but a transcendence is impossible.
So in the final section, let's talk about deconstruction's legacy. Deconstruction is clearly not as big as it used to be. What happened to deconstruction? I mean, where did it go?
So today, in 2020, deconstruction is sort of like Freudianism. It's been repudiated everywhere, but it's saturated how we think. Deconstruction, though, I don't think there are today very many people who would explicitly identify themselves as deconstructionists. What happened to deconstruction? Well, in part, I think it just ran its course. People had exploited the nuances of Derrida's thinking just about as well as they could. What also happened was that the kind of opposition that Derrida got at the Baltimore conference in '66 never really went anywhere. I mean, scholars like Angus Fletcher and Charles Singleton, who assailed him at that conference, represented deeply entrenched scholarly traditions that never accepted deconstruction, didn't think it was compatible with what they did, and actually regarded as one large flash in the pan. So deconstruction was really cool and happening for a while, but it was never without opposition. I have to say, I don't think most of that opposition was very principled or thoughtful. I don't think people were really reading Derrida seriously, but they were right that in some sort of deep intuitive way, just as Georges Poulet said, it was deconstruction or them. So anyway, deconstruction had run its course, but there was no obvious successor. And then the Paul de Man scandal happened. Paul de Man was a very prominent deconstructionist at Yale. He had actually been at the Baltimore conference with Derrida, which is where they met and became very good friends. And then de Man, it emerged, had written some anti-Semitic pamphlets for Le Soir when he was a younger man. He also turned out to be a kind of unpleasant person. In any case, deconstruction became tagged with all sorts of unsavory historical influences. And at that point, I think the burden of boredom and antipathy and misreading, et cetera, just became too much to sustain the deconstructive enterprise. And it kind of collapsed, I think, leaving behind the kind of ideas we've been talking about today, just as powerful as they were, though now being deployed within a very different sort of political context.
That's amazing. That was such a great concluding remark.
Thanks. It's been really good talking with you guys.
Thank you to David. Thank you for those last words. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we'll hope to talk to you next time.